So we begin with our traditional Boker Tov, good morning, on this wonderful Sunday morning. Today's topic is a sensitive topic because, you know, it touches on certain sensitivities amongst people in our society. You know, there's the old saying, don't discuss religion and politics with friends and so on. And this discussion is sort of both religion and politics, although the intent over here is not to discuss politics, and I'm going to try to stay away from that as much as possible. The intent is more to, since this is a Torah class, is of course to share words of Torah. And since Torah is not meant to be just remain in the abstract, the objective over here is to try to take the Torah teachings as it relates to some of what we are learning these days and apply it to life. That is the primary objective of Torah. Torah is, the word Torah means a guide to life. So therefore, we are having this discussion with that intent, rather than to have any sort of political discussion and so on, even though it might, not only it might, it will be addressed in some way. But first we always start with a bracha. So if you have your own coffee, make your own bracha. If not, answer Amen. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Shehakol Nihiyah Bidvaro. Okay. I heard that loud, thunderous Amen. You know, we just celebrated Lag BaOmer, a very, very auspicious day. You know, there is a known. Well, you know, when we talk about a country divided, to some extent, that's, although important to us and it's part of our life, but it's a little bit more distant than our own life. And of course, peace and harmony begins at home, and that's where it is most important in our lives. You know, there are various levels of peace and harmony. There's peace amongst countries. There's peace within the country. There's peace within the home. And there's peace within yourself, between your struggles, between your, what might be called in the language of Torah and Chassidus, between your Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, between your drive, your animalistic drive, between your drive to holiness and goodness. And all that is part of what's necessary to have peace and harmony. Some of us focus on peace amongst nations, even though there's not much that we could do about it. Some of us focus on peace within the country, where we could do more about that. Some of us focus on peace within the home, which is, of course, definitely something that's our realm of responsibility. And some of us focus on peace within ourselves, which is solely and completely within our responsibility. Now, in terms of marriage, peace in the home, there's no question, and this deserves a class unto itself, that, you know, the institution of marriage, as it is called in this country, the institution of marriage is under threat. Is under threat on various levels. There is a known, world-renowned expert by the name of John Goodman. I think his name is Hebrew, and his Jewish name, I think, is Yosef Mordechai Goodman, or Gutman. He's a practicing, an observant, religious, practicing Jew, and he has become highly respected in the world of marriage counseling. And so he has observed over years that when asking what is the cause of a breakdown between husband and wife, often it is how they are able to communicate with each other, especially in areas where, and primarily in areas where they disagree. Those who know him and have worked with him said that he could observe a couple for 15 minutes and see how they interact by just basic questions. Who will go leave the work and go pick up the kids, and who will what are some of the other examples that he's giving over here? I don't remember all the examples right now, but simple examples of life that just don't come to my mind right now. And by observing these couples and how they interact, he could, within 15 minutes, determine if they will be able to survive another 3 years of marriage, and he is 90% accurate. And it's usually, not usually, as I said, it is how they could tolerate a disagreement, how they could tolerate opposite opinion. This class is a lot of it is based on a class given by Rabbi Ashkenazi, and he mentions that he had a couple in his community that unfortunately their marriage fell apart, and he asked the fellow, what is it? At what point did you detect that was sort of the beginning of the end? What was it? What was it? Where was it? You guys got married, you loved each other, and so what happened? And he said that one time we were touring, and I wanted to spend money on a camera, and my spouse, my wife, was so dismissive of that desire that the way the disagreement was presented was so, what I took as such an offense, was so disrespectful to my position, that was the beginning of the end. It wasn't some like major catastrophe. It was just that show of lack of respect, of dismissiveness, that for him, he was the beginning of the end. Now, maybe there's more to the story, but this is the story that sheds some light onto our discussion. But I want to elaborate on this, take it a little further, talk about this within the context of Lag BaOmer, because this is a Torah class, and see how we apply this, its application to life and to maybe broader life. So let's get into it. And in the process, you will definitely learn some nice stuff. So we celebrated Lag BaOmer. I will take the guess over here that many of you listening to this class know what Lag BaOmer is, and many of you do not. So just to give you a little insight into Lag BaOmer is unique from all Jewish holidays, sort of celebrations. Jewish holidays can be divided into three categories. One are biblical, like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the holiday of Passover, the holiday of Shavuot, the holiday of Sukkot. Those are biblical holidays that are in the Torah, biblical holidays. Then there are rabbinical holidays that the rabbis established, and to most of you, these two holidays are known. One is Hanukkah and one is Purim. Those are the two rabbinical holidays. The only other holiday celebration that has become a celebration amongst all of Israel to this extent is Lag BaOmer. I mean, you could maybe include within that also Tu B'Shvat, but I would not say that it has attained the level of celebration as did Lag BaOmer. But you might argue that you will put Tu B'Shvat into that category, but definitely Lag BaOmer. Now, what happened on Lag BaOmer? What is it that we are celebrating? What's the reason for celebration? And there are two occurrences that happened on Lag BaOmer, which, brought about this celebration. Now, the more known reason for Lag BaOmer is is that this is the day of the passing of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, the great and holy Tana of Mishnaic times, the author of the Zohar, known as sort of the biblical, as the Bible of Jewish mysticism. Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi in Miron, Jews visit throughout the year, Jews and many and Gentiles and so on, and pray and ask for miracles and so on. And on this day, Lag BaOmer, the 18th day of the month of Iyar, which we celebrate this past Thursday, is where Jews recognize and celebrate the life of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. That is the more known element of this historical moment, sort of this that we celebrate on this holiday, and because the Rashbi, when why specifically with making bonfires, as is customary, is because the Zohar tells us that when the Rashbi passed away, a great fire descended from heaven and welcomed Rashbi's and separated everybody from the holy soul of Rashbi, and he ascended to heaven on this day. And Rashbi, Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, asked that this day should be celebrated as a wedding day rather than a day of sadness, and that is the more known reason for celebration of Lag BaOmer. However, the earlier and also known but not as well known, the earlier reason for Lag BaOmer is related to a piece of the Talmud. The Talmud in Tractate Yevamot tells us the following. The Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, had 24,000 students. These 24,000 students, says the Talmud, died in a plague, they died in a plague between the holiday of Passover and Shavuos. During these 49 days, they died, and why do we celebrate on Lag BaOmer? So the Meiri, one of the very known commentators on the Talmud, says that more specifically, when did they stop dying? They stopped dying on Lag BaOmer. Even though the Talmud says between Passover and Shavuos, which continues for approximately 2.5 weeks after Lag BaOmer, nevertheless, says the Meiri, when did they stop dying? These 24,000 students, they stopped dying on Lag BaOmer. And that is why, because they stopped dying, the plague stopped, which means there were students who were coming from Corona, and many of us, almost all of us, know loved ones, relatives who passed away during this terrible plague, disease, and so on, right? Or pandemic. So there was a plague, and they stopped dying. They stopped dying on Lag BaOmer, which means those who survived it, and that is the reason for great celebration. So that is the reason, second, but really first reason for the celebrations of Lag BaOmer. Now, why did these 24,000 students die? And it's interesting. I mean, the Talmud asks the question. Now, you could give the simple answer. There was a plague. There was a plague, and people die in a plague. But the Talmud is not satisfied with that answer. The Talmud says there must be a spiritual reason for why the 24,000 students of the great Rabbi Akiva died. And listen to what the Talmud tells us. And I know this is known to some and new to others, but there's much to be analyzed over here. The Talmud says that the reason why the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died during this period is because lo nohagu kavod ze lazeh. They did not act respectfully. Kavod means respectfully, with respect for one to another. And because they did not act respectfully to one to another, that is why the plague, they were not protected during a time of a plague, which is a time where sort of death is rampant, or to use the more spiritual term, the Satan, the Malach HaMavat, the angel of death, has been given more free reign, and therefore even people who maybe ordinarily would not be punished so severely are not protected, and that's why they died during this period of time. So again, the words the Talmud uses is shelo nohagu kavod ze lezeh. They were not respectful to one another. Now, that is the statement in the Gemara, and let's analyze that. There's a very strong question over here. First of all, the students of Rabbi Akiva were great men. They weren't just, political hacks that have this passionate disagreement and disrespect for each other. They were Torah students. They were great men. And to take the question a step further, they were students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, anytime someone is a student of a teacher, you would expect them to be influenced by their teacher. How much more so when we're talking about a Torah description, and the Torah refers to them as students of Rabbi Akiva. So in the Talmud, which is part of the true word of Hashem, of Torah, describes them as students of Rabbi Akiva, that means they were genuine, true students. They didn't just hang around on college and have parties. They were students of Rabbi Akiva. They internalized the teachings of Rabbi Akiva. So in that light, we have a very, very strong question. In Yiddish, we would say, "Akasha was warft sich vor die Augen," a question that is thrown in front of, is right there in front of our eyes. Rabbi Akiva is the author of the very, very famous statement, which says like this. The Torah says, "V'ahavta l'reyacha kamocha." The Torah tells us, the Bible says, you should love your fellow as you love your friend. Rabbi Akiva adds, he says, "Ze klal gadol b'Torah." This is a major principle in the Torah. This is what Rabbi Akiva adds. Rabbi Akiva, these are men of truth. Rabbi Akiva adds that it's not just a thought, a nice suggestion. That means Rabbi Akiva personified, taught this, and certainly sort of inculcated it or drilled it into his students. And Rabbi Akiva himself lived his life that way. Rabbi Akiva was a primary example of showing true love to a fellow. There are many stories, starting with his own wife, of how he treated his own wife Rachel. Because of limitation of time, I'm not going to go into the story. I mean, the Talmud relates Rabbi Akiva as a worker, and worked for someone for 3 years, and then the fellow, before Rabbi Akiva was to return home for the holidays, asked him to get his pay. He's going home, and the fellow said, "I don't have any fields to give you." He said, "Don't you have this?" He listed a bunch of things, and constantly he said he doesn't have. And this fellow was a wealthy man. Rabbi Akiva said, "Okay," and he left. The fellow, after Rabbi Akiva's home, and a while later, all of a sudden, wagons of goods shows up with his employer, his wealthy employer, and he says, "Here, I'm here to pay you." He says to Rabbi Akiva, "Rabbi Akiva, when I told you I don't have fields and I don't have all what you requested, what did you think? How did you judge me?" And Rabbi Akiva responded, "I thought that perhaps you had a moment of inspiration and you dedicated and you consecrated all your belongings to the Holy Temple." And the fellow said, "Yes, that is true, and I am amazed that you judged me for the good. And now that I was able to come up with that, with the ability to pay you, I'm here to pay you." So this was Rabbi Akiva. We're talking about someone of great character and his students. So what does it mean that his students were not able, that they did not have respect for one another, and therefore they sadly and tragically died? 24,000 students died during this plague. By the way, as a side note, last week I was, today we live in a time where there's so much abundance of good things being shared. So there's a rabbi, his name is Reb Melech Biederman. He gives many lectures in Yiddish, and he gave just a beautiful thought on this story of Rabbi Akiva and the 24,000 students, because they, as I mentioned, we celebrate Lag BaOmer because they stopped dying. And there's another nuance to this celebration, which is very beautiful in its own right. There's another nuance, which is that after Lag BaOmer, what continued in history was that Rabbi Akiva continued to teach, and five great students whose names appear throughout the Talmud, continued the teachings of Torah from one generation to the next. One of them was actually Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. And so these five great students of Rabbi Akiva are the reason we have Torah today in 2022, in 5,782, because they were the link that brought Torah from one generation to the next. Remember, then things weren't written; it was all given over orally. And these great teachers went ahead and passed it on to the next generation. So Rabbi Biederman pointed out a beautiful thought. He says, "Remember, Rabbi Akiva just lost 24,000 students. This is after teaching them for years. The Talmud tells us that these were years and years of investment. And these were his beloved students. And they all died. If you're Rabbi Akiva, you have every justification to sink into the deepest depression and just close your yeshiva and say it's all over, finished, geendigt. What else could I do? I taught 24,000 students. I just went through the worst coronavirus in my own world, my own community. But yet, Rabbi Akiva said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get up and I'm going to continue teaching. And he found five students and he taught them. Not 24, that five students. And that is what continued our heritage, our Torah, until today's day. Because Rabbi Akiva refused to despair in the face of such tragedy. And he said, what's my response? I have many questions. I can question, I can retire, I can despair, but no, I'm going to go on. I'm going to go on teaching. So it's a beautiful thought in its own right. But getting back to our subject over here, and our question is, how is it possible that the students of Rabbi Akiva would not have respect for each other? And here the Rebbe tells us something extremely important. And I hope and I pray to Hashem that I am interpreting and understanding this correctly and applying it in a broader sense correctly as well. The Rebbe says the following. Other commentaries give different answers, but the Rebbe says the following. The Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, says the following. He says that it's the other way around. And this goes to a critical difference between love and respect. And we'll elaborate on that in a moment. The difference between love and respect. Rabbi Akiva, if you notice, the Talmud uses the expression, he doesn't say they didn't love each other. Remember, Rabbi Akiva says to love your fellow Jew is a great principle in the Torah. So certainly they loved each other. The Talmud uses, by design, the Talmud uses the term lo nohagu kavod ze lazeh. They did not give adequate, proper respect for one another. The word in Hebrew, kavod, means weight. They didn't give the other the proper space and weight. And let me elaborate, let me explain what that means. The following. It is the other way around. Because the students of Rabbi Akiva loved each other so much, that's why it translated unfortunately, in a lack of respect. What does that mean? When each student, you sit by a teacher and you hear their words, their teaching, every student takes it with their nuance. It's the way it is, right? You hear something, you hear it from your teacher, and you think about it and you internalize it, and each one of us have a certain way of how we apply it. And a lot of times, depending on the character of sort of our soul and even the purpose of our mission here in this world, we might take the teacher's words and not distort it, because then you're lying, but genuinely understand it in a certain way. So each student of Rabbi Akiva heard Rabbi Akiva the way they taught, and they truly understood it, and the truth, the way they saw it, was absolute, because these were honest and true, complete people. And therefore, when the they went excitedly to share with their fellow student the way they understood the teachings of Rabbi Akiva. The other student might have had a nuance which was different. So student number one, because of his love for student number two, did not rest until he could try to convince student number two. When student number two, who had the same approach and same attitude, rejected student number one's approach, who genuinely was not satisfied with just leaving things as is, but I have to convince student number two, not because of selfish reasons, because how could you disagree with me, but because I love you and I truly believe that you're not understanding the words of our teacher. The result was that he couldn't respect this fellow student. He says, you're distorting the words of my teacher. You're not ready to accept the love and the truth, that's even more important, of what I want to give to you. I cannot have respect for you. It was because of their greatness. They weren't fake people. They weren't false people. They weren't external people, superficial people. So that is why it translated in Le'nohagu v'kavod zalazeh. The fact that they were punished tells us that that they were wrong with that approach. As high and as pure as they were, you cannot allow it to affect the respect. And more deeply, you need to understand that truth does have different colors. This is a difficult subject, but there are various angles to truth and different approaches to truth. And you have to understand and come, just like there is 12 tribes, because each tribe has a different purpose, mission, approach. And what's true and real for one approach is also true and real for another approach, and you must understand and recognize that. Which is why we find something interesting. I mean, these are nuanced concepts, and I hope it's being expressed clearly and vital in life, and how to apply this in the broader sense, as I will try to explain and bring this all home. It's interesting that if you look in the Rambam, applying this to marriage for a moment, if you look in Maimonides, taken from the Gemara, I want to read here, let me find it, what the Rambam says. Hold on a second. I have this right here in front of me. Okay, so here. You know, we said because they loved, they couldn't respect. Their love brought actually to non-respect, and sometimes that happens. So, over here, if you look in the Rambam says like this. The Rambam says, you know, we talk about, the Rambam says, respect is different than love. And let me explain it. The Rambam said, bear with me over here, because I'm thinking as I'm speaking. The Rambam says the following. Do I have the Rambam? Here's the Rambam. Here's the Rambam. In Hebrew, and then I'll translate. The Rambam says, Tzivu Chachamim, our sages commanded. Listen to these words. Sheyehei Odom mechabed es ishtoi yoter migufo. That a man should respect his wife more than he respects himself, his own self. This goes, you know, both spouses, but the Rambam puts it as a man to his wife. Chayav adam lechabed et ishto yoter migufo. A person is obligated to respect his wife more than oneself. Ve'ohava kigufo. And he likes her as he likes himself. He's supposed to respect her more than he respects his own self, and likes her as he likes himself. Now, liking oneself, liking someone else as you like yourself is a tall order. It's difficult. But if you notice, the Rambam puts that second. First he talks about respect, and then he talks about love. See, love is more something within yourself. how that love translates to the other could actually sometimes even be hurtful and damaging. You love somebody and therefore I will not let you do this, this, and this, which sometimes is wrong and hurtful. I love you and therefore I might stifle you. I love you and the love might be genuine, but the end result, the action that comes about out of that love is not always helpful and beneficial. As opposed to respect, respect means how I actually treat the other person. Respect is thinking of the impact on the other person. There's a story told about the Arizal, the great holy Arizal. The Arizal was once walking with his student, Reb Chaim Vital, in Tzfat, in the great city of Tzfat. If you've been to Tzfat, give us some thumbs up. Tzfat is just a wonderful city. And the Arizal was walking, and one of the scholars in the city that sort of took himself a little seriously, sort of walked right in front of the Arizal to sort of walk in front of the Arizal. And when it came time for them to turn off the street where they were going, the Arizal kept on walking after this fellow. And Reb Chaim Vital, the famed student of the Arizal, said to his teacher, don't we have to turn off here? And the Arizal says, I could see from his actions that he wants the respect that people should see that I'm walking behind him and giving him that respect. So I'm going to continue walking. Why not give him that respect? So this is the holy Arizal that recognized that although that this person needed that respect, respect is how you treat the other person. And therefore Maimonides says that mechabdo yoter migufo. The problem with the students of Rabbi Akiva was they loved each other deeply, but the love and how they acted based on that love brought about, unfortunately, to a place of disrespect. Or at least did not respect their student enough as becoming to the students of Rabbi Akiva. And this came about because they were so inspired by Rabbi Akiva's teachings that love your fellow as yourself. There might be some more questions over here, but this suffices for today's discussion. Now, what's the application of this? It's interesting that the Rashbi, we talk about the fact that Lag BaOmer represents both the day that we celebrate because of the plague that stopped, and the day of the passing and the life of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. Rab Shimon Bar Yochai exemplifies the epitome of holiness, and yet being able to give respect and help and be helpful to someone who is the opposite or doesn't live according to that holiness. The Talmud tells us, we know that the Rashbi had to run away from the Rashbi, acronym for Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, had to escape the Romans. He lived in a cave for many years. When he came out, he came out with his son. And the Talmud tells us that something super miraculous happened. His son, Rabbi Eliezer, who lived with his father for all these years and was super intensely holy, when he saw a person just being involved in mundane things like farming the field, said, how can somebody forsake and neglect spirituality, Torah study, prayer, and be involved in such mundane activities? And his kepeda, the very criticism of Rabbi Eliezer, would severely harm the person that he was judging. Whereas whatever harm befell this person, Rabbi Shimon would heal. Rabbi Shimon would reverse that and bring healing. And he went around trying to fix what needed fixing. Because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai reached the level as the next generation sort of student, the 5 students of Rabbi Akiva, he reached the understanding and level where he could have love for another person, and that love should, in other words, Rabbi Eliezer, his son, also loved that person, which is why he couldn't understand and tolerate that how the person is being neglectful in his spirituality and holiness. Rabbi Shimon said, different people, different roles, different approaches. You got to help them. You got to be respectful. You got to be helpful. You got to be there for them. So the Gemara tells us, and with that we will try to bring this to conclusion, that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, two of the most famous houses of study, yeshivas in the days of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, would constantly have disagreements with each other. And the Talmud says, Eilu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, both are the words of the living God. Long explanation what that means. But nevertheless, the halacha, the final Jewish law, follows the teachings of Beis Hillel. Why, says the Talmud? Because three things. Number one, nochin va'aluvin. I'm using the actual language. They were nochin, they were pleasant, and they were willing to accept some critique. They didn't get all bent out of shape when they were critiqued. Number two, they would actually repeat and learn and study the words of their opponent of Beis Shammai. They would pay attention to it. And number three, they would actually even present the teachings of Beis Shammai even before their own teachings. And that's why the halacha, the final Jewish law and opinion, went according to Beit Hillel. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Let's conclude over here. What does this mean? First, let's talk about it, let's say, within the context of your home and your relationship with your spouse or your partner at work. So let's follow the example of Beit Shammai. First, respect for an opinion that's not yours is highly important in terms of the proper relationships between people. When your wife or somebody who has another opinion that you disagree, you strongly disagree, passionately disagree. So first of all, like Beis Hillel, you have to listen. You have to truly listen. Not only listen, you have to put their words before yours, meaning you have to really give and pay attention and respect that they have an opinion and their opinion might be right. And then you think about your opinion and then you come to your conclusion. But the other person has to feel that you're giving him the proper respect. They say a story with one of the very famous poskim. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was a famous halachic authority in Israel and respected throughout the world, that at his wife's funeral, as many of you know, that if you've been to a loved one's funeral, that it's customary you ask forgiveness of the deceased before they are interred, before they are put into the ground. Reb Shlomo Zalman publicly said in front of his deceased wife is that I do not have to ask forgiveness because I never offended my wife. And after the funeral, one of his students asked him, and they knew Reb Shlomo Zalman sort of was a humble man. He said, I mean, how could you say so? You never disagreed? You never had arguments? He says, yes, we've had lots of arguments, but it was never, ever done without respect for the other person's opinion, approach, and so on. We argued, we listened, and with respect, we disagreed. So that's the Beis Hillel model. That's what Lag BaOmer is teaching us. And I want to, this sounds simple, and I want to apply this. The title of the class is a passionately divided country. So these are nice words and can be applied in given situations. Can this heal the situation in our country? I don't know the answer to that. I'm simply not smart enough for that. However, I want to suggest an application of all this into the situation, both in life and on a broader scale. And this is my own thinking, so you could take it or leave it, meaning this is the way I'm trying to apply that which we've just learned. And you're welcome to disagree or to add or to give insight. I would love to hear feedback. So we have passionate disagreements in this country. I mean, for the most part, it's sort of divided into conservatives versus liberals. You have, I think, a model and a lesson that we could learn from this situation, from this discussion. First and foremost, you have to listen. In my personal view, of Remmel Friedman, there are nuances, there are, not nuances is the right word, there are approaches, there are solutions that are valid and positive in sort of both sides of the aisle. One of the problems is that we don't even listen to each other. We don't even listen to each other. Another problem is that there isn't for sure a proper love for a sort of many of from one aisle to the other side of the aisle as fellow sort of countrymen, fellow citizens. Again, learning from the model of Rabbi Akiva and his students, and Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Now, there is another important discussion over here, which is, what are the red lines? There always are red lines. In other words, there are times where people that have, in your opinion, your mind, crossed the line that they don't deserve the respect, and they don't deserve the love, and perhaps they're your enemies, or they have entered into the world of evil and need to be fought with all the tools you have. Because the reality of life is that there is evil out there. So these are red lines which can be hard to define. Are the red lines because they passionately disagree with you? That's not a red line. That's not a red line. That's a different opinion. And as Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, the story from Rabbi Akiva, we need to listen to what the other person has to say. I would suggest, this is a suggestion, and I myself need to think about this more. I would suggest that the red lines, if we're talking, let's say, in the world of holiness, in the world of Torah, the common denominator that the students of Rabbi Akiva had is that they were students of Rabbi Akiva, and they were students of Torah. They didn't, God forbid, deny Torah. They didn't come out and say, we reject the teachings of Rabbi Akiva. They were all dedicated and committed to the teachings of Rabbi Akiva. So even though one student might think that you are totally distorting the teachings of Rabbi Akiva, the fact that he is committed and he equally believes that I'm teaching the words of the Torah means that he's not out of your red line. That's one suggestion that I'm giving over here. So how do you apply that maybe in a marriage? In a marriage is, if you're both dedicated to the marriage, and there is that love for each other, and you're dedicated to the marriage. So even when you passionately disagree, and when I think that what you're doing is totally wrong, but you have that overall Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, you're dedicated to the marriage, there has to be respect. And you have to act on that respect and allow that person to have their opinion. On a society level, the way, again, I understand it, is that if you are dealing with people who are truly love this country, it's easy to say, well, you hate the country. No, those are tools. But if you're dealing with people, a position that truly love the country, respect the foundations of the country, the basic values of the country, the constitution of this country, if you're dealing with people like that, but they have passionate disagreements with you, then they fall within, they're not out of the red line. If they are what we might call, I don't like the word you're radical, because a person could be passionate about an opinion and you might call them radical. I said, if they're out of those lines, they don't love this country. They don't respect the foundations of this country, then I would suggest, and I say this carefully because, I'm not looking to create more discord. On the other hand, you got to be truthful. I would suggest that in that case, they've stepped out of the red line. But if they are Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, I say that lahavdil from Torah and secular, they are committed to the betterment of this country. They believe in the institutions, the basic institutions of this country, but they have a vehement disagreement with you on how to approach it. You have to give them the respect. You have to give them the love. You have to allow them their opinion, etc. This is my thoughts, sort of in my opinion of how, to change and to impact, at least in a significant part of sort of our country, in its attitude to one another. There is, and by doing so, starting within our own world, by being a light as we often repeat over here, ma'at or docha harbe choshech, a little light pushes away a lot of darkness. By being committed to this in our world, a little bit of light dispels a lot of darkness. So this is my thoughts and application of the Torah teaching. Thank you for listening, for giving me that zchut, that merit. Please share these words of Torah so that we dispel more and more light. You are welcome to disagree. I would love to hear your feedback. As I say, also suggestions for future classes. Some topics I'll accept, some I won't. But have a fantastic, amazing, great week. Thank you for listening.